if not for the sterile atmosphere that permeated every inch of it. Ava sat at the nurse's station, the soft hum of fluorescent lights above her head, the only sound breaking the quiet of the early shift. She was tall, with dark brown hair pulled back into a neat bun. Her scrubs were navy blue, freshly pressed, with a small name tag pinned to her chest. Eva, it read, simple, efficient. She had been working here for just over a year now, and the hospital had become almost like a second home. The routines were predictable. The faces of the patients, though often weary and pale, were nothing new. There was a certain comfort in the repetition of it all. Eva glanced at the clock. 8:15 a.m. The shift had started just 15 minutes ago, but already the hallways were starting to fill with activity. A nurse wheeled a gurney down the hall. A doctor in a white coat briskly passed by, absorbed in his notes. She had already checked in with her patients for the morning. Most of them were recovering well, though some required extra monitoring. It was a typical start to the day. Her partner for the shift, Daniel, sat at the other side of the station, flipping through a patient file. He was quieter than most, but friendly enough. They exchanged small talk occasionally, but more often than not, they slipped into a comfortable silence. The air around them was calm, almost too calm. The world outside the hospital windows was quiet as well, overcast, with clouds hanging low in the sky. It was the kind of weather that made everything seem a little slower, a little more somber. The hospital itself had been around for decades. The building's exterior was a blend of old brick and modern glass, one of those places where history lingered just beneath the surface. The hallways, though bright, seemed to stretch on endlessly. Every door was the same, every turn another familiar corner. There were only a handful of rooms Eva needed to tend to today. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that screamed urgency. Most of her work would involve routine checks, making sure the machines were working, checking vitals, taking notes. As she made her way down the long hallway, she passed a small group of visitors in the waiting area. A woman was sitting in a chair with her hands folded, her gaze lost somewhere in the distance. An elderly man stood by the window, looking out at the gloomy weather. The low hum of the air conditioning filled the space, punctuated only by the occasional cough or shuffle of feet. Eva nodded to a few familiar faces as she passed, her steps steady, methodical. She made her way to room 312, just a routine check. She could hear the faint sound of a television playing from inside the room before she entered, the soft flicker of light from the screen barely visible through the half-open door. Inside, an elderly woman was sitting upright in bed, a blanket tucked neatly around her shoulders. Her thin white hair was neatly combed, and her eyes were bright, sharp despite her age. She smiled as Eva entered, a tired but warm expression. "Good morning, Mrs. Anderson," Eva said, pulling up a chair beside the bed. The woman's smile widened. "Good morning, dear. How's the day treating you so far?" Eva couldn't help but return the smile, leaning in to check her vitals. "Busy, as usual. How are you feeling today?" "Much better than yesterday, thank you," Mrs. Anderson replied, her voice steady. "Though I do wish they'd bring me something more exciting to watch on the television. This soap opera nonsense is giving me a headache." Ava chuckled, adjusting the IV in the woman's arm. "I'll make sure to pass along the suggestion for better TV programming." As she worked, she noticed the small things, the slight creak of the old bed frame as Mrs. Anderson shifted, the way the air seemed a little too cold for comfort, despite the temperature being just right. The hospital had its quirks, sure, but it was the kind of place that settled into your bones after a while. You didn't expect much out of it, but you knew what to expect. Her shift continued uneventfully for the next few hours. She checked on a few other patients, all in varying food was predictable, the conversation light. She talked with Daniel about the upcoming weekend plans, a lazy hike, maybe a visit to the local farmer's market. Nothing out of the ordinary, but as the afternoon wore on, something in the air began to shift, just slightly. It was subtle at first, just a feeling, really. Eva didn't pay it much mind. It was probably just the exhaustion settling in, the way the hospital seemed to take on a different rhythm as the day faded into evening. The shadows grew longer, the light from the windows dimming as the sun slipped lower in the sky. By the time her shift was ending, Eva was ready to head home. She grabbed her bag from the locker room, gave Daniel a quick nod, and made her way toward the exit. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly as she passed beneath them, a faint hum buzzing in the silence. She barely noticed. The hospital doors slid open with a quiet hiss, and Eva stepped out into the cool evening air. She took a deep breath, grateful for the space, the quiet. The street outside was calm, the world still wrapped in that overcast blanket. She started down the sidewalk, her footsteps echoing softly against the pavement. The hospital was behind her now, but a small part of her couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lingering in the air, something just beyond her reach, something off. She shook her head, trying to shake the odd sensation. Probably just the exhaustion, she thought. She'd be back tomorrow. But as she rounded the corner to her apartment building, she glanced back once more at the hospital in the distance. The lights flickered again, this time more noticeably. And in that brief moment, the world felt just a little bit colder. The next few days at St. Mark's Hospital felt much like any other. Eva slipped back into her routine with ease. The faces of the patients blurred together, a mix of old and young, some sick, some recovering. It was quiet, predictable. The smell of disinfectant and the sound of distant beeping machines were the steady backdrop to the ebb and flow of her days. Yet, there was something off, something small, but present enough to notice if you paid attention. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. One morning, Eva walked into the break room to find the coffee pot already half full. She didn't remember making it, but perhaps it had been Daniel. He often made coffee when he arrived early, and Eva typically didn't arrive until just before the shift began. Still, she couldn't shake the odd feeling that someone had been there before her, and not just in the usual way. She shrugged it off, assuming it was just the early morning haze, the kind of confusion that came with the lack of sleep. The rhythm of the hospital didn't leave much room for personal reflection. Most of the time, she found herself moving through the motions, each step a necessary one to keep the machine of the hospital running smoothly. But little things started to creep in, like the faint sound of footsteps echoing down the hall long after the last nurse had clocked out, or the inexplicable feeling of being watched. It wasn't a tangible presence, but the kind that made you glance over your shoulder, unsure if you'd really heard something, if you were just imagining it. One afternoon, after a long shift, Eva took her usual route home. She was tired, exhausted even, and couldn't wait to get into bed. As she walked past the looming stone facade of the hospital, she noticed something strange. A figure stood at one of the upper windows, just behind the thin curtains, a shadow, unmoving. She squinted, trying to make out any detail, but the window was too high, too far. The figure didn't move. She rubbed her eyes, dismissing it as fatigue. She had seen people pass by the windows before, nurses and doctors finishing late shifts, but tonight, it seemed different. The figure wasn't part of the usual routine. She shook her head and continued on, brushing off the unease settling in her chest. It had to be her imagination. She had been working too many late shifts lately, after all. Days turned into weeks, and Eva tried to push aside the started to follow her. She continued her work at St. Mark's without incident, but the little oddities accumulated. A machine in the ICU that would suddenly beep in the middle of the night, even when all the vital signs were stable. An empty room that, for no reason she could pinpoint, always felt colder than the others. A hallway that seemed to stretch on longer than it should, like time itself was warped within its sterile walls. One evening, as she prepared for the night shift, she stood by the nurse's station, organizing the charts for the oncoming rounds. Daniel was beside her, but the usual chatter was missing. He had been quieter lately, less present in the usual exchanges. She glanced up, catching his gaze as he stared out the large glass windows into the parking lot. He hadn't said much all day, but there was something off about him, something that felt a little too distant, too far away. "You all right?" Eva asked, a note of concern creeping into her voice. Daniel didn't respond right away. He blinked, as if startled by the question, and then offered a thin smile. "Yeah, just tired. You know how it is," he said, brushing a hand through his hair. His voice was flat, almost mechanical. Eva nodded, not completely convinced. "You sure? You've been off lately?" "I'm fine," he insisted, though his eyes drifted back to the parking lot, distant again. Eva didn't press the issue further. She had known Daniel long enough to know when to leave it alone. But the conversation didn't sit right with her. The way his words felt like they came from somewhere far away, not the man she had worked beside for months. She watched him for a moment longer before turning back to the charts. The rest of the shift passed uneventfully, and the two of them slipped into a rhythm that was as ordinary as any other. But something about the atmosphere had shifted, a subtle change that neither of them acknowledged out loud. The quiet was heavier, more oppressive, the kind of quiet that made you feel like there were things lurking just beyond the periphery of your awareness. That night, Eva found herself unable to sleep. She had returned to her apartment, but the air felt thick, as if something was pressing in on her from all sides. The walls felt too close, the shadows too long. The television in the corner of her living room, which she had left on for noise, seemed louder than usual. Every flicker of the screen made her jump, and every creak of the old building's foundation sounded like it was coming from right behind her. She tried to shake off the unease and curled up under the covers, but it wouldn't go away. The feeling of being watched, of something standing just out of sight, waiting for her to acknowledge it, gnawed at her. And then, in the middle of the night, she heard it, a soft knock at her door. At first, she thought it was just a dream, the kind of hazy, half-sleep sounds that slipped into her mind without making any sense. But then the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Her heart raced as she lay perfectly still, listening to the silence that followed. No more knocks, no footsteps, just the stillness of the night. Eva got out of bed slowly, her breath caught in her throat. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the door. Her mind raced, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was just a neighbor, maybe someone in the building, though that didn't explain the strange stillness that followed. Cautiously, she approached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. But when she opened it, there was no one there, just the empty hallway, quiet as always. She stood there for a long moment, half expecting someone to appear around the corner. But the hallway was empty, and everything felt as it should, for now. The following days passed by in a blur for Eva, the gentle rhythm of hospital life settling over her once again. Each morning, she walked through the sliding glass doors of St. Mark's as if nothing had changed, as though the oddities of the last few weeks hadn't slipped their way under her skin. The fluorescent lights hummed above her head as she navigated the sterile corridors, checking on patients, making small talk with nurses and doctors, the comforting normalcy of the place wrapping around her like a warm blanket. Yet, despite the routine, there was always something faintly out of place. It started with the small things, the type of things you might dismiss as coincidence if you weren't paying attention. One afternoon, Eva was on her way to the break room when she passed by the supply closet. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for her to see that the lights were still on inside. She was certain she had turned them off after the last round of stocking. Pushing the door open just a crack, she peered inside. The room was empty, the shelves neatly arranged with medical supplies. The fluorescent light buzzed, casting its harsh glow over the room, making the shadows sharp and angular. It wasn't the light or the room itself that unsettled her. It was the stillness, the feeling that the air was holding something back, something unseen, waiting for her to leave. She closed the door quietly, brushing the odd sensation aside. Maybe she was just tired. The shift had been long, and her mind had started to play tricks on her. But then, there was something else. A fleeting moment, like an echo of sound that she couldn't place. A whisper, soft but distinct. It wasn't directed at her, but it felt close enough to make her pause. She glanced around the empty hallway, her steps halting for just a second before she moved on. Eva had worked at St. Mark's long enough to know that hospitals had their own peculiarities. There were strange noises in the walls, whispers in the air conditioning vents, and faint rustlings that you couldn't always explain. It was easy to dismiss most of them when you were busy, focused on the immediate needs of the patients, the never-ending cycle of charts and beeping machines. But this felt different. There was an undercurrent of something unfamiliar creeping into her daily routine. The next morning, Daniel seemed more distant than usual. Eva noticed it when they passed each other in the hallway. He wasn't his typical self. He didn't offer his usual tired smile, didn't make the small, casual remarks about how the day had been. His eyes looked hollow, as if he was somewhere else entirely. "Hey," Eva said softly, stepping in front of him. "Everything all right?" He blinked, as though waking from a daydream. "Yeah, fine. Just not much sleep," he replied, his voice flat, distracted. Eva frowned but didn't push. There was something about the way he spoke, the lack of energy in his words, that made her uneasy. It wasn't like him, but they were both used to long shifts, the pressure of working in a hospital that seemed to pulse with a kind of quiet urgency. Maybe he was just overworked. She didn't think much more of it, not at first. But as the days wore on, the feeling of unease grew. She found herself looking over her shoulder more often, her eyes darting to dark corners or empty rooms, as though expecting something to be waiting for her. She couldn't explain why. Nothing had changed, nothing had happened, but the sense of waiting, of something hovering just out of sight, grew more persistent. One evening, while she was going through patient records at the nurse's station, she noticed a strange detail in one of the charts, a patient she didn't recognize. The name was familiar, but she couldn't place it. The record was thin, almost too thin, with barely any medical history listed. The only note in the margins was a single line, scribbled hastily in red ink. "Room 309, don't go near." The note sent a chill down her spine. Eva had worked at St. Mark's long enough to know that nurses and doctors could be secretive, sometimes covering up mistakes or creating cryptic notes for reasons she didn't always understand. But this felt different. The room was in the farthest wing of the hospital, an area she rarely visited. Eva couldn't recall ever hearing of a patient in room 309, let alone anyone with the name on the chart. She hesitated set the chart down. Her curiosity tugged at her, but she knew better than to entertain thoughts like these. Still, the words, "Don't go near," echoed in her mind like a quiet warning. She didn't mention it to anyone. A few days later, she found herself walking down the hallway near that section of the hospital. It was nearing the end of her shift, and the halls were quieter now, the hum of the fluorescent lights mixing with the distant murmur of nurses' voices. As she passed room 309, she paused, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. The room was dark. Even from the hallway, she could see the faintest movement inside, a shadow flickering across the window. She couldn't tell if it was the rustling of curtains or something else, but there was something unsettling about the stillness of the room, the way it felt as though it was holding its breath. Her heart beat a little faster, and she quickly moved on, the uneasy sensation gnawing at the back of her mind. The next morning, she overheard a conversation in the break room between two senior nurses. They were discussing a patient that had been admitted late last night, someone in critical condition, though they didn't give many details. The only thing that caught Eva's attention was the mention of room 309. "Another one from 309, one of the nurses said, shaking her head. "I don't know what's going on over there, but it's always something with that room." The other nurse gave a tired shrug. "They're just patients, nothing special. We'll keep them stable like we always do." Eva didn't press further, but as she listened to their casual dismissal, a small knot of dread formed in her stomach. Something about their tone, the way they spoke about that room as though it were just another place, unsettled her deeply. It felt as though there was something beneath their words, something left unsaid. Later that day, after finishing rounds, Eva found herself walking through the hall again, her feet taking her toward room 309 without her consciously deciding to. Her hand hovered over the door handle, heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't planned this, hadn't meant to investigate further, but now that she was here, she couldn't seem to stop herself. She reached for the door, but before she could touch it, a voice behind her stopped her in her tracks. "Eva, you don't want to go in there." It was Daniel, his voice unusually sharp. She turned to face him, but he was already walking away, his back to her as he disappeared into the distance. Eva stood frozen for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air like an omen. And then, with a final glance at room 309, she turned away, not knowing what to think or what to believe. But the feeling of being watched, of something quietly waiting, never quite left her. The days at St. Mark's passed in much the same way they always had. Eva settled into her routine with a steady rhythm, quiet mornings, busy afternoons, and late nights filled with charts and rounds. She worked alongside Daniel, whose quiet presence had become almost like an anchor during the long shifts. They exchanged brief words when necessary, and on rare occasions shared a laugh over something mundane, a miswritten prescription, a momentary slip-up by a new nurse. But there was something about the monotony of it all, the hollow buzz of the fluorescent lights above, that made the hospital feel more like a place where time went to die. And yet, despite the routine, something in the air seemed to have shifted, something subtle enough to slip under the radar if you weren't paying attention. Eva noticed it on a Thursday evening. The evening air outside had turned damp and cool, the streets slick with the last remnants of rain. She stepped into the break room, the sharp smell of microwaved food and stale coffee greeting her as usual. The low murmur of her colleagues' voices blended with the hum of the refrigerator, creating a kind of background noise that felt almost comforting. She poured herself a cup of coffee, the warmth from the mug radiating through her hands, and leaned back against the counter, letting herself relax for a moment. Daniel was sitting at the far corner of the room, scrolling through his phone phone with a distracted look on his face. Eva glanced at him, about to make some casual remark about the weather, when she noticed something odd. He wasn't wearing his usual scrubs. Instead, he had on a black hoodie, his sleeves pushed up to his elbows. He hadn't worn it to work, and as far as she could recall, he hadn't mentioned leaving at all. It seemed strange, given that his shift was just as long as hers. "Daniel," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "You all right? You don't look like you're on shift right now." He blinked at her slowly, his eyes seeming to take a moment to focus. "Oh yeah, just needed to grab something," he muttered, his voice distant. He seemed off, more distant than usual, though Eva couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Eva nodded, the tension in her chest returning, that familiar unease creeping back like it always did lately. She glanced out the window. The night had settled in, the hospital's dull glow reflecting off the wet pavement outside. The usual sounds of the night shift had started to filter in. Footsteps, the occasional far-off chatter in the hallways. But there was something missing. Some sound, some pulse that had once kept the place alive, now felt muffled, drowned by a deeper silence. "Did you hear anything strange last night?" Eva asked, more out of idle curiosity than any pressing concern. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He set his phone down with a soft click, and his gaze shifted towards the window, as though the question hadn't fully registered. He didn't seem disturbed, but there was a brief flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "I'm not sure what you mean." Eva tried to mask her confusion with a small smile. "I don't know, just the usual strange noises. You know how it gets around here. Sometimes it feels like the building's whispering." She watched Daniel closely as he picked up his coffee. He didn't look at her, but the muscles in his jaw twitched. It was small, almost imperceptible, but enough for Eva to notice. Something wasn't right. "Maybe you're just tired," Daniel said, his tone soft, too soft. His eyes flicked over to her, and for a split second, the intensity in his gaze unnerved her. Then he cleared his throat. "You should get some sleep. You're running on fumes." Eva didn't respond, though she felt a pang of discomfort in her chest. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was just imagining things. After all, she hadn't been sleeping well lately. Those late shifts, the constant hum of the machines in the ICU. Her mind was a bit of a blur by the time her shift ended each night. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place, an intangible presence that she couldn't quite explain. The night wore on, and the hospital moved through its usual cycle. Eva found herself in the hallways more than she would have liked, checking in on patients, making rounds, pushing through the relentless monotony. But as the clock ticked toward midnight, a strange stillness settled in. The hallways, usually bustling with activity, were quieter than usual. A few nurses passed by, but the footsteps seemed muffled, as though the building itself had swallowed the sound. Eva rounded a corner toward the ICU, where she was supposed to check on a patient, and it hit her again, the odd sensation of being watched. It was faint, but undeniable, like a shadow that brushed against her mind without fully appearing. She paused, her hand resting on the cold metal of the doorframe. The ICU was darker than it should have been, its usual array of beeping machines and soft lights now muted, their glow casting long shadows across the floor. Everything was still, too still. Eva glanced over her shoulder. The hallway was empty. Taking a breath, she stepped inside, the faint click of her shoes against the floor seeming to echo louder than usual. As she approached the first bed, she froze. One of the monitors had gone off, an unusual blip, a small anomaly in the otherwise steady readings. The patient in the bed was still, his Eve's chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. But something about the machine felt wrong. She reached for the controls, adjusting the settings, when the overhead lights flickered. Once, twice. Then they went out entirely, plunging the room into near darkness. The emergency lights clicked on a moment later, casting everything in a harsh, sterile red. Ava's heart skipped a beat, the sound of her breath suddenly loud in her ears. She waited, her eyes darting toward the corner of the room. A feeling, cold and sharp, crawled up her spine. There was a faint rustling sound, as though something, or someone, was moving just beyond the line of sight. Her breath caught, and her pulse quickened. She shook her head, trying to steady herself. It was nothing. The building was old. The lights were temperamental. Nothing to be concerned about. But when she turned to check the monitors again, she noticed something. Another small detail, one she hadn't seen before. A patient chart had been left on the floor. Not by her, and certainly not by anyone else in the room. It was the chart for room 309. Eva's heart sank. She hadn't been near room 309. She hadn't even seen the patient assigned there in days. But there it was, the chart on the floor, half open, its pages bent at the edges. The words scribbled at the top were barely legible, but she made out one line in dark ink. Leave it. Do not disturb. A cold shiver ran through her. She picked up the chart and turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of it in her palms. She didn't know why, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was no coincidence. It felt too deliberate. She left the ICU quickly, her footsteps quickening with each turn down the hall. But when she passed by room 309, her steps faltered. The door was ajar, just a crack, as though someone had been inside recently. The dim light from the hallway cast long shadows across the floor, and the door creaked faintly as if inviting her in. For a long moment, Eva stood frozen, staring at the door. Then, almost against her will, her hand reached out, and the door swung open. There was no one inside, just the sound of the wind, faintly rattling the window. The room was empty, but something had changed, something she couldn't explain. And as she turned to leave, she felt it, something behind her, something watching her every step, something that had always been there, waiting. The days passed in the usual monotony. Ava felt the hours blend into each other, the never-ending cycle of care and paperwork becoming almost soothing in its predictability. The smell of antiseptic, the cold clang of trays being wheeled down the hall, the soft murmur of nurses discussing cases. It was all part of the rhythm of the hospital. The outside world, with its ebb and flow of seasons, felt distant, as though the building itself had somehow sealed them off from everything beyond its walls. Ava's routine remained largely unchanged. She would arrive for her shift in the early morning, the sun barely touching the horizon, the parking lot still empty except for a few early risers. The long gray hallways of St. Mark's echoed with the quiet sound of her footsteps, and the building felt as familiar as her own home. Most days, she would work through the steady flow of patients, checking charts, assisting with procedures, and offering what comfort she could to those who needed it. It was the sort of place where life and death mingled quietly, side by side, and where nurses like her had learned to walk that fine line with a sense of detached grace. But lately, there was a tension in the air that Eva couldn't quite place. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but after a few days, it had begun to worm its way into the corners of her thoughts, coloring her perception of the hospital in strange ways. It wasn't anything specific. No sudden loud noises, no inexplicable shadows. But there were small moments, small shifts in the atmosphere that made her second-guess herself. One evening, She stood by the nurse's station, filling out a set of forms for an incoming patient. The room was bustling with the usual quiet chaos, nurses darting in and out, doctors consulting with one another, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead punctuating every word spoken. But as Ava glanced up from her paperwork, she noticed something. The hallway outside was empty, completely empty. Now, that wasn't strange in itself. It was late, after all, and most of the patients were either asleep or in their rooms with family members. The night shift had already begun, and people tended to move quietly after hours. But as she looked down the hall, she couldn't shake the odd feeling that someone was there. She scanned the corridor, her gaze lingering on the distant corners where the walls curved, where the hospital's maze of wings intersected. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing near the window at the far end, their silhouette barely visible in the dim light. It was only a flicker, a brief second where she thought she saw a shape, but when she blinked, it was gone. She told herself it was just the tiredness, the constant pressure of the job. After all, Eva knew the hospital well. It had a way of playing tricks on your mind, especially when you spent as many hours there as she did. She had seen enough things in the corners of her vision over the years, strange shadows, fleeting shapes, that she had learned not to take them seriously. But it lingered in her thoughts, just the same. The next few shifts passed in much the same way, predictable, repetitive, but still, Ava couldn't shake that unease. Something about the hospital seemed off. The halls felt colder, the lights flickered a little more than they used to. And though she knew the layout of the building better than anyone, she found herself pausing occasionally, unsure of where she was or how long she had been walking. It was on one of those days that she first saw the woman. Eva was walking down the long corridor that connected the ICU to the surgical wing when she saw her. The woman was standing just outside room 218, her back turned toward Eva, her figure slight and fragile. She was wearing a long, pale hospital gown, her hair hanging loosely down her back. Ava was a little taken aback at first. The hospital was known for its older, more senior patients, but this woman seemed too young, too out of place, and she didn't remember seeing her on the patient list. "Excuse me," Eva called gently, taking a step forward. "Can I help you?" The woman didn't turn around. Her shoulders were hunched slightly, as if she was trying to avoid being noticed. Eva hesitated. There was something strange about her. She felt an odd pull to approach, to offer her help, but at the same time, a nagging doubt tugged at her mind. The woman wasn't in a hospital gown that looked like it belonged to the ward, and she didn't appear to be in any distress. "Are you okay?" Ava asked again, her voice growing quieter. Still no response. Just as she was about to step forward again, the woman turned, abruptly. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. But when Eva saw her face, she froze. The woman's face was pale, her eyes wide and distant. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, her gaze unfocused, as though she were looking through Eva rather than at her. The eyes were empty, yet filled with a sadness that seemed to pull at something deep within Eva's chest. "Is something wrong?" Eva asked, her voice soft but firm, trying to mask the creeping discomfort she felt. The woman just stared at her for a long moment. Then, without a word, she turned and began to walk down the hall, her bare feet making no sound against the floor. Ava watched her go, unease settling like a weight in her stomach. The hospital was full of patients who wandered or had moments of confusion, but this felt different. She hesitated for a moment, then turned to look at room 218. The door was closed, and the nameplate next to it was empty. No patient listed. No one was supposed to be there. Confused and unsettled, Eva stepped away from the hallway and continued on with her rounds, trying to put but the air in the hospital felt heavier, thicker somehow, as if the walls were closing in. She couldn't quite explain it, but there was a sense of something waiting, something quietly building just beneath the surface. As she made her way through the usual tasks, she found herself glancing over her shoulder more often than usual, checking the corners of the rooms and hallways as if expecting something or someone she couldn't see. And then she found herself standing in front of room 309 again. This time, the door was open, not ajar like before, but fully open, as if inviting her in. Eva felt the familiar chill run down her spine. She didn't know what it was that made her pause, but something inside told her to turn around, to walk away. But she didn't. Instead, she stepped forward, her shoes echoing in the silence of the hallway, each step heavy with the weight of an unspoken question. The moment she stepped over the threshold, she was enveloped in the faint smell of something metallic, something old, but it wasn't the scent of blood. No, it was something worse, something unfamiliar. And as the door swung shut behind her with an almost deliberate click, Eva's heart skipped a beat. The room was empty, but something was there. Something had always been there. And this time, it wasn't going to let her leave so easily. The door creaked again, as if something was waiting behind it. The weeks passed in a rhythm that felt almost too comfortable. Eva began to slip back into the comfortable monotony of hospital life. The beeping of the machines, the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes, the endless hum of fluorescent lights. These things were the background to her days now. There was a certain peace in the routine, despite the long hours and the constant pressure to stay alert. But something about the atmosphere of the hospital had started to shift. It wasn't enough to be alarming. No, that would have been too obvious. But there was a subtle disquiet that began to seep into her thoughts. Small things that didn't quite add up. It was as if the hospital itself was changing, quietly, around her. One morning, during a break in the afternoon shift, Eva found herself sitting in the small lounge, sipping a cup of coffee and reading through some charts. She hadn't seen Daniel in a while, and the usual hum of voices from other staff seemed muffled as if coming from a distance. She looked up and noticed the soft gray light filtering through the small windows of the break room, casting long, tired shadows on the walls. It felt too quiet. Eva shook her head, trying to shake the thought. The hospital was always quiet at this hour. This wasn't unusual. The night shift was just wrapping up, and the day crew hadn't fully arrived yet. Everything would settle back into place in a few hours. But still, there was a strange edge to the silence, something that felt wrong. She leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting to the clock on the wall. It was nearly time for her to get back to the ICU, to check on the new patients coming in. But as she stood, a soft creak from the hallway caught her attention. She froze. It wasn't a sound she could easily place. A faint dragging noise, like the shifting of something heavy across the floor. Eva didn't move. She glanced toward the hallway, but saw nothing. Just the usual long stretch of linoleum, the sterile white walls of the hospital hallways leading to the rooms. Probably just someone moving equipment, she thought. There was always something being moved around, always some sound or other. Still, that dragging noise seemed out of place, too slow and deliberate to be a cart or an object being pushed. She stepped out of the break room and into the hall, her shoes clicking against the floor as she walked cautiously toward the source of the sound. The hallway was empty, save for a few staff members who passed by, too engrossed in their own tasks to notice her. Eva glanced toward room 309 again, her eyes lingering on the closed door. For a moment, she thought she saw something, a figure, perhaps a shadow, moving quickly past the window inside. But when she blinked, there was nothing, No movement, no presence. She stepped forward, her footsteps quicker now, a sense of urgency building in her chest. The dragging sound seemed louder now. It was coming from further down the hall, from the direction of the storage rooms. Ava hesitated for a moment, caught between her growing curiosity and the sense that she should walk away. Her hand brushed the cold metal of the door to room 309 again, a feeling of hesitation creeping into her mind. Something about the room felt wrong. She pushed the door open with one hand, her fingers brushing the doorknob. It creaked slightly, but opened easily. The room was still dark, the dim emergency lighting casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. Everything looked unchanged, but it was the air in the room that unsettled her. The usual antiseptic smell that filled the hospital was somehow thicker, heavier. Ava's breath caught for a moment, her chest tightening as she stepped inside. Something wasn't right. She tried to focus on the usual tasks, checking the patient charts, adjusting the machines. But the sense of wrongness lingered, growing as time passed. It was in the way the room seemed to close in around her, in the strange chill that had settled into her bones, the kind of cold that didn't belong in a hospital room. Ava turned to leave, but then she stopped. A small sound, soft, almost imperceptible, came from the corner of the room. A slight rustling, like fabric moving in the wind. She turned sharply toward the sound, but there was nothing there, just the empty bed, the faint hum of machinery. The moment stretched on, frozen in time. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps the wind had caused the curtains to shift, or perhaps she was just imagining things after a long day. But even as she turned and left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting there, just beyond her line of sight, watching her, waiting. That night, the hospital seemed different again. It was a strange, subtle change. Nothing overtly sinister, nothing that would have made a passerby stop and take notice. But for Eva, it was enough to make her uneasy. The hallways felt emptier, even more silent than before, and the shadows along the walls seemed to stretch longer than they should. It was a typical night shift, the kind she had grown accustomed to over the years. Nothing out of the ordinary. But there was an edge to everything. Every creak, every soft murmur of voices in the distance felt somehow off. She walked through the ICU, checking in on her patients. Her hands moved automatically, the motions of her job as natural as breathing, but her mind kept drifting back to room 309. Eva hadn't seen anyone in or out of the room all night. No nurses had reported anything unusual, but something about the empty room gnawed at her, as if it was calling her back. She found herself there again, standing outside the door, her heart hammering a little faster than usual. This time, she didn't hesitate. The door opened without resistance, the familiar click of the handle echoing in the empty hallway. Inside, the room was just as she had left it. No patients, no visitors, no sign of anything out of place. The machines hummed softly in the background, their steady rhythm almost comforting. But then her eyes caught something. A small detail that hadn't been there before. A piece of paper. It was crumpled at the foot of the bed, barely visible in the dim light. Eva bent down to pick it up, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, hurried, the ink smeared in places, but it was the words that caught her attention. Don't let them see. Her blood ran cold. Eva's hands tightened around the paper as she glanced around the room. The air felt thick, heavy. There was no sound, no movement, just the distant echo of footsteps in the hallway. But that feeling of being watched was back, stronger this time, as if something, or someone, was standing just behind her. She quickly crumpled the paper and stuffed it in her pocket, a growing sense of unease washing over her. It was just a note, she told herself. Just a note from a patient, perhaps. But the words seemed to linger in the air, as if they were meant for her and no one else. And just before she stepped out of the room, she heard it again. That soft creak, the sound of something moving, just out of sight. Something was different. Something had changed, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. As Ava turned to leave, the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening bang. The lights flickered, plunging the hallway into darkness. The next few days blurred into one another, a quiet, almost imperceptible rhythm that Ava had grown accustomed to. The morning light, pale and soft, filtered through the narrow windows of the staff break room. Nurses came and went, the low murmur of their voices filling the space between brief moments of solitude. Ava sat at the table, reading over the list of patients, adjusting to the gentle pulse of the day. It was the same as always, until it wasn't. There was a shift in the atmosphere that she couldn't quite explain, not in the usual ways, a flickering light or a strange noise, but something subtle, almost too quiet to pinpoint. It wasn't that the hospital felt dangerous or threatening. It felt waiting, like it was holding its breath. Ava rubbed her eyes, trying to dismiss the nagging feeling as fatigue. The night shifts had been long lately, and though she'd had a decent rest after her last shift, something about the hospital felt different. She took a slow breath and checked her watch. It was nearly time to start the rounds, the usual tasks, checking on the patients, taking vital signs, assisting with medications. But as she rose, something shifted again, like a slight tremor in the air. It started with the phone call. Ava had just stepped into the ICU when the intercom crackled to life. "Ava, can you come to the front desk, please? There's an issue with one of the patients in room 214. It was the kind of routine call that she'd received 100 times before. Room 214 was a fairly quiet section of the ward, tucked away near the far corner. Nothing unusual, nothing to worry about. Eva gave a nod to a passing nurse and made her way toward the front desk. The corridors seemed more expansive today, the walls stretching out in the dim light. The sterile scent of the hospital, so familiar, felt slightly different, more pungent, almost sharp. She chalked it up to the cleaning chemicals, but the more she walked, the heavier the air seemed. By the time she reached the desk, the receptionist was already on the phone, talking in hushed tones. She waved Ava over, gesturing to the monitor. "We've had an issue with a patient in 214, the receptionist said quietly. "It's strange. The monitors were fine a minute ago, but they've started malfunctioning." Eva's brows furrowed. Monitors malfunctioning wasn't unheard of, but something in the receptionist's tone made her uneasy. There was a hesitance in her voice, an edge that Ava couldn't place. "Okay, I'll go check on it," Ava replied, her voice steady, but a sense of discomfort creeping in. Something about the way the receptionist wouldn't meet her eyes made Eva feel like there was more to the story. Room 214 was just down the hall, and Eva moved with practiced ease through the hospital's familiar maze. Her shoes clicked on the tiles, the sound amplifying in the stillness, but something about the hallway felt different today. It felt empty, too quiet. Even the lights seemed dimmer, flickering almost imperceptibly as she passed under them. She reached the door to room 214, her hand resting on the cold metal handle. The room was dark inside, the blinds drawn shut as usual. She paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch around her, and then opened the door. The patient in 214, an elderly man with a chronic heart condition, was lying in bed, his chest rising rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. The heart monitor beeped normally, the usual pulse of life punctuating the otherwise still room. Nothing seemed out of place. But then, she noticed something strange. The chair next to the bed, empty, as it always was, seemed too close to the bed. Eva couldn't remember if it had been that close before. It wasn't an issue, just a small detail, but it stood out, as if it had been moved, even though she was certain she had not touched it. She walked over to the machine, adjusting a few dials and checking the readout. The heart monitor continued its steady beeping, no indication of any immediate problem. Eva exhaled in relief. "Everything's fine," she muttered to herself, taking a moment to check the patient's vitals before turning to leave. But just as she reached the door, something caught her eye. On the floor, near the chair, a small, crumpled piece of paper. Eva knelt down, picking it up, her fingers grazing the slightly damp surface. The paper was thin, worn, as if it had been handled repeatedly. She unfolded it carefully, squinting at the hastily scrawled handwriting. "She watches. Don't turn around." Her pulse quickened. The words were nothing she hadn't seen before. Notes from confused patients, the ramblings of those who had been in the hospital too long. Still, her hand trembled slightly as she folded the paper back into place and tucked it into her pocket. She hesitated at the door, glancing back at the patient, then the empty chair. Something in her gut told her to leave, to forget the note and go back to her rounds. But instead, she lingered. The room felt too still, like it was holding its breath, waiting. The following days felt like a blur. The sense of unease continued to linger just under the surface, a dull, persistent presence that Eva couldn't quite shake. It wasn't enough to disrupt her work. It wasn't that obvious, but it was there, like a shadow following her down the hall. She couldn't place what was causing it. Was it the patients she'd seen recently? The ones who'd muttered strange things in their sleep? Was it the unsettling feeling that sometimes accompanied the late-night shifts, when the halls seemed too empty, too quiet? Or was it something more, a growing sense that the walls of the hospital were watching her? It was the small things that kept her on edge, the faint whispers she swore she heard coming from rooms when no one was there, the soft tapping noises from behind closed doors, the sense that, every now and then, she wasn't quite alone, even when she was certain no one else was in the hall. And then came the lights. It wasn't anything catastrophic. The lights flickered in the hallways, as they always did on occasion, the bulbs buzzing faintly as they strained against their age. But over the course of a few nights, the flickers became more frequent, more unpredictable. The darkness between the bursts of light seemed deeper, thicker. At times, it felt as though the shadows themselves were lingering a little longer than they should. One night, as Eva walked down the main corridor, the lights flickered once more, casting the hallway into brief but absolute darkness. It wasn't the usual soft hum that accompanied it. This time, the lights buzzed with an intensity that made her flinch. When they returned, everything seemed the same, but there was something just off, a feeling that lingered in the air. She stepped carefully, her heart beating faster now, her eyes darting from one end of the hallway to the other, searching for anything out of place. That's when she saw it. At the far end of the hall, near the nurse's station, a figure stood in the shadows, a shape, tall and thin, too still, too silent. Ava's breath caught in her chest. She blinked, and when she opened her eyes again, it was gone. Her heart pounded in her ears as she quickly walked toward the station. But when she arrived, everything was as it should be, empty, silent. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the image, telling herself it was the product of exhaustion, of the night shift. But even as she turned to leave, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched, and it was getting harder to tell what was real. The next few days passed in a rhythm that was almost too normal. Ava found herself falling back into the routine she had become so familiar with. The quiet hum of the hospital, the steady rhythm of monitors, the soft murmur of voices from the nursing stations. It all felt like a distant, comforting soundtrack to her life. It was easy to forget how things had started to feel off, easy to push the strange sensations and the growing unease into the back of her mind. But like the slow creep of winter's cold, the unsettling feeling kept coming back. She had gotten used to the quiet, too quiet, halls of the hospital at night. The occasional flickering light, the eerie silence that stretched between the soft beeps of the monitors. But tonight felt different. Ava didn't know how to explain it, but the stillness was thicker than usual, as if the air itself had become dense with anticipation. It was after the third or fourth flicker that she began to notice it. The dimness wasn't just in the hallways, but seemed to seep into the rooms themselves. Rooms that had once been filled with soft, artificial light now felt strangely muted, as if something was dampening the brightness, dulling the edges of the world. The steady hum of the ventilation systems, so constant it had become almost unnoticed, felt quieter too. At first, Eva thought it was just the exhaustion from another long shift, a lack of sleep playing tricks on her. But the more she moved through the halls, the more she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was no immediate danger, no clear threat, but there was a sense of something, waiting, watching. She paused outside room 216, where an elderly woman had been placed after a recent surgery. Mrs. Clark had been stable for the past few days, a small blessing in an otherwise busy ward. Eva glanced at the chart as she approached the door. Her eyes lingered on the time. It had been just over an hour since the last check-in. Mrs. Clark was scheduled for another round of medication soon. As she pushed the door open, she immediately felt the temperature drop. The room, usually warm and sterile, had an odd chill to it tonight. It wasn't cold exactly. It was more of a persistent, uneasy coolness that seemed to sink into the bones. Mrs. Clark was lying in her bed, her eyes closed, the heart monitor beeping steadily. It was the same as always, and yet, Eva stepped closer, the floor beneath her squeaking faintly as she moved. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch just a little too long, as if the darkness had thickened. She looked at the elderly woman, whose frail hand lay limp at her side, and for a brief moment, Eva thought she saw something in the old woman's eyes, something more than just sleep, a flicker of awareness. Eva froze, but then the moment passed, and the old woman's eyelids fluttered. Just a dream. Of course, it was nothing. Still, Eva couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She adjusted the blanket, checked the oxygen levels, and made a note of her vitals on the chart, but the feeling lingered. It wasn't until she left the room that she heard it. A whisper. Soft, so faint she might have imagined it. At first, she thought it was just the ventilation system, a distant noise carried through the ducts. But as she stepped into the hallway, the whisper seemed to follow her. Eva. She turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. There was no one. The hallway stretched out before her, dim and silent as ever. But she could have sworn she heard it again. This time, it was closer. Eva, don't. The sound was unmistakable. Eva's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped back into the hallway. She glanced down at the floor, her eyes darting from side to side, but no one was there. It had to be a trick of the mind. She shook her head, trying to dismiss it. Exhaustion was playing games with her, making her hear things that weren't there. But Even as she walked away, the air felt heavier, the silence more suffocating. It wasn't the usual calm of the night shift. It was something more oppressive, something pressing in on her from all sides. The next few days were much of the same. The shifts were long, the work steady, but the feeling never quite left her. If anything, it only intensified. Eva began to notice little things. The occasional creak of the floorboards in the ICU when no one else was there. The faintest hint of movement from the corner of her vision when she passed certain rooms. It wasn't enough to be alarming, but it was unsettling. The kind of feeling that gnawed at the edges of her mind, urging her to pay attention, to notice. One evening, as she walked toward the nurse's station, she noticed something strange. A stack of patient files, neatly organized and left alone just moments ago, had been moved. Not much, but enough to be noticeable. The corners of the papers had been bent, the order disrupted. It wasn't like the usual disorganization that came with a busy shift. It was deliberate. Eva glanced around. No one else was nearby. She reached for the files, trying to reorganize them, but the sensation of being watched returned, prickling down her spine. She quickly replaced them, forcing herself to focus on the task. The feeling faded, but only for a moment. It was during her rounds the following night that she found it, the note. It was tucked beneath a pile of charts in one of the rooms she rarely visited. Room 201, a small, windowless room at the far end of the hall. It was a storage space, not for patients, but for equipment, empty, dusty, and unused. She hadn't even realized the door was unlocked. She'd only stepped inside to grab a box of supplies when she spotted it. A small piece of paper, folded, its edges crumpled. Eva didn't know why, but she felt a strange compulsion to pick it up. They know you're here. They're waiting. Her blood ran cold. She stood in the room for a long moment, staring at the words as though they might change, as though the strange warning might make sense in some way she couldn't yet understand. But it didn't. It didn't make sense. It only unsettled her more, a knot tightening in her stomach. She tucked the note into her pocket quickly, stepping out of the room with a sense of urgency, as if the shadows themselves might start to close in on her. Eva's thoughts were a blur as she made her way back down the hall. The hospital, once so familiar and routine, had begun to feel alien, hostile even. The sense of being watched had intensified. It wasn't just in the corners of her vision anymore. It was in the air. The building itself seemed to be waiting, patient and silent. That night, as she stood at the nurse's station, filling out reports, the lights flickered again, and this time, they stayed off. The sudden darkness swallowed the hallway, pulling everything into shadow. The usual hum of the machines, the whispers of distant voices, everything seemed to halt, as if the world had paused. Eva stood in the dark, her heart pounding as the flicker of the emergency lights cast long shadows on the walls. She could feel the weight of the silence, thick and suffocating. And then, from somewhere deep within the bowels of the hospital, she heard it. A sound so faint, so distant, that she wasn't sure she had heard it at all. A whisper, and this time, it wasn't her name. It was something else, something darker. Help us. The chaos of the past hour felt like a haze in Eva's mind, a disorienting blur of shadows and whispers that had pulled her through an ordeal she could hardly comprehend. Her heart still pounded in her chest, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away, but the echo of "help us" lingered in the corners of her mind. It had all happened so quickly. The stairwell, the flickering lights, the terrifying scrape of nails against metal as something invisible had moved through the shadows. Her breath had come in desperate gasps, her hands shaking as she gripped the railing, fighting against a force she couldn't where sound and movement had once thrived. Eva had felt it before she understood it. Something had been lifted. Something malevolent had been quieted. Now, standing in the dim hallway outside the emergency room, she could hardly believe it was over. The hospital, which had once felt like a second home, now seemed like a stranger. The sterile smell of antiseptic, the constant hum of machines, the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors, it all felt foreign, as if she no longer belonged here. Her fingers gripped the edge of the wall, steadying herself. She had escaped. She had confronted whatever that thing was, whatever it had been, and come out of it alive. But she wasn't sure if it was truly gone. The air still felt thick with an unnatural presence, as though it were hiding in plain sight, waiting for her to let her guard down. "Eva," the voice snapped her back to the present. She turned, startled, and saw Nurse Alice standing at the far end of the hall, her face drawn with concern. "Are you okay? I heard something. I thought I heard you running. You look shaken." Eva swallowed hard, trying to clear the tremor from her voice. She wanted to say something, anything, to reassure Alice. But how could she explain what she'd just experienced? How could she possibly make sense of the unspeakable, of the way the very walls of the hospital had seemed to close in on her, the dark thing that had whispered, touched, and threatened her very soul? I'm fine," Eva finally managed, though it didn't sound convincing, even to her own ears. "Just a little overwhelmed." Alice's eyes searched her face for a moment, her brow furrowing. "It's late, Eva. You should head home, get some rest. You've had a long shift." Eva nodded absently. Rest. What she really needed was answers, clarity. But the more she thought about it, the more her mind swirled with confusion. The hospital had been changed. She had been changed. That thing she'd confronted in the dark, that force or presence, she didn't know if it was gone or if it was just waiting for the right moment to strike again. As she turned to leave, she couldn't help but glance down the hallway toward the stairwell where it had all started. The lights above flickered once more, casting eerie shadows on the walls. But there was no sound, no movement, just the silence that felt so much more unsettling than the noise had been. She walked slowly, deliberately, each step echoing through the quiet halls. As she passed room 216, where Mrs. Clark had been resting, she heard a faint rustling from within. She hesitated, hand lingering on the doorframe. There was something about the room now, something different. It wasn't just the stillness that unsettled her. It was the way everything seemed too still, the way the shadows lingered at the edges of the room, more pronounced than before. She turned the handle, the cool metal cold against her fingers. Inside, the elderly woman lay in her bed, the steady beep of the monitor filling the air. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, Eva wondered if she had imagined it all, the whispers, the shadows, the terror. But as she stepped further into the room, she saw it. The note. It was lying on the small metal table next to Mrs. Clark's bed. The same paper, the same crumpled edges, the same chilling words. "They know you're here. They're waiting." Ava's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't placed the note here. She hadn't even seen it before. And yet, it was here, in the exact same place she had found it before, as though it had appeared out of thin air. But there was more. As Eva stared, the steady beep of the heart monitor began to slow. The quiet rustling of Mrs. Clark's sheets intensified. Eva stepped forward, heart hammering, as she noticed something she hadn't before. The faintest, barely perceptible shimmer in the air. A shift, as if the very room itself was bending, stretching, warping around her. It was then that she saw it, through the glass of the window, in the reflection, standing just behind her. A figure. It was faint, barely a silhouette, but its shape was unmistakable. Tall, thin, and impossibly still. Eva froze. It was the same thing she had felt in the shadows, the same presence that had whispered her name, the same thing that had stalked her through the halls. Her pulse raced as she turned, but there was nothing there, only the empty room and the steady rhythm of Mrs. Clark's breath. She reached for the door, her hands trembling, but before she could open it, she heard a faint voice, soft, almost gentle, but unmistakably clear. "You shouldn't have come back." Eva spun around, but the room was still empty, the shadows in the corners no longer seeming so innocent. Her body felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were pressing in on her, suffocating her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the air felt thick, charged. Something was wrong, so wrong. Her thoughts were spiraling, her mind racing to understand what was happening. The presence, the hospital, the things she had heard, the things she had seen. She had barely taken a step toward the door when she felt it. A cold hand, icy, clammy, grip her wrist from behind. Eva gasped, her body going rigid with terror. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there, just a vacant room, a flickering light, and an overwhelming, suffocating sense that she was not alone. The silence came again, thick and heavy, pressing in on her chest. And in that moment, Eva realized that the nightmare was far from over. As she backed out of the room, she glanced once more at the faint outline in the window. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure was still there, watching her, waiting.